Hi, my name is April. Let's talk about books. Today, I'd like to share with you a list of 7 books that I have read and enjoyed having to do with the topic of women during and after World War I. These two topics, women during war and World War I, are things that I enjoy separately, and so the two of them together are a perfect combination. Let's start with the one that kicked off this interest for me, which is called Brilla of Ingleside, and it's by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Now, you may recognize that author's name because she wrote Anne of Green Gables, which is my favorite book of all time. In this book, Rilla, the main character, is Anne Shirley and Gilbert Blythe's youngest kid. And she is getting ready for the best summer ever. She's so sure it's going to be amazing. She's like 15 years old and she feels like she's on the brink of adulthood, and then boom, somebody shoots the Archduke over somewhere in Europe. At first she thinks this isn't going to have any effect on her or her family, but boy, is she wrong. As Rilla kind of processes her feelings about this war and about how it's, first off, selfishly kind of messing things up for her, she does throughout the book grow and develop and change her feelings and become much more mature. She starts a Junior Red Cross, she adopts a war baby, she falls in love, and in addition, she also suffers some loss. She does talk about how difficult it is just to wait, and because information didn't flow as quickly as it does now, sometimes the family would get news of a battle that their loved ones had fought in, but they wouldn't know if those men had survived that particular battle. And so that period of anxiety and of tension really took a toll on them, and she does talk about that in this book. For a really long time, this was the only book that I ever read about World War I, but when I began teaching history, I started to get more into the nonfiction side. And speaking of nonfiction, the next book is Women Heroes of World War I, 16 Remarkable Resistors, Soldiers, Spies, and Medics, and it's by Catherine J. Atwood. This book is actually written for young adult readers, but I liked it anyway. And she talks in here about women who served their countries, whether they were asked to or not. They just kind of felt that pull, they felt that call of patriotism and call to duty. And here are 4 that I remembered specifically because I did read this book quite a while ago, and I am going to say their names incorrectly, so I apologize in advance. The first is a British nurse whose name was Edith Cavell, and she's probably the best known of all of the people that are mentioned in this book. She was executed by the Germans for being a spy, and her execution was used as propaganda in England to kind of foment hate against the Germans. The next one was a French teenager, and her name is Emilienne Moreau. This is a teenager who defended her town against German soldiers. In fact, she shot 2 of them. She was meant to be executed herself, but she in the end wasn't, because the Germans were a little leery after that whole Edith Cavell thing. The next woman that I remember was a Russian woman, and her name was Maria Bakareva, and she petitioned the Russian government to be allowed to fight herself. And when she was given permission, she recruited a whole bunch of other women, and so they were kind of rough and tumble, and she told them to behave like men, and I guess they went out and kicked some butt. And the final woman that I remember was an American woman, a reporter whose name was Madeline Zabriskie Doty, and she would file stories that would tell about the brutal realities of war. She wasn't one to just kind of gloss over and say, oh, you know, we're doing really great over here, and everybody's really, you know, pounding those Germans. Instead, she wrote about what it was really like, which was terrible, if you know anything about World War I. The next book is kind of a creative nonfiction or creative memoir. It's actually based on some diaries, but the book itself is fictional, and it's called Not So Quiet, Stepdaughters of War, and it's written by Helen Zena Smith, which is the pseudonym of a woman whose name is Evadne Price. And she had been approached by a publisher to write a parody of the book All Quiet on the Western Front by Eric Remarque, which is a fantastic novel. But she thought the idea of writing a parody of this war novel was really offensive. So instead she just went for it, and she wrote about women ambulance drivers in France using the diaries of Winifred Constance Young. And what I didn't know before reading this book is that a lot of the women who were driving those ambulances in France were upper class women who'd never really done hard work in their entire lives. And so here they were out in the mud and getting lice and not being able to bathe all the time and not having set sleep times and still just persevering. And I really liked this book. It is definitely an anti-war, pro-pacifism book, because she definitely doesn't paint this to be as any kind of glorified cause. Maybe the women went over there thinking, I'm doing this for my country, but eventually they just got to wishing that the war was over, as many people do. The next one is actually a series of books, and the main character of these books is Beth Crawford. This is a mystery series. The first in the series is called A Duty to the Dead, and it's written by Charles Todd, which is actually a mother-son team of Charles and Carolyn Todd. And Beth Crawford is a nurse during World War I. And so, again, this is a little lighter in terms of the subject matter than the ones that I've already mentioned, but she, as a nurse, is still out there performing surgeries and watching men die, even as shells are falling all around her. She's even injured a couple of times herself, but as she's serving, sometimes she goes home on leave and she's solving mysteries at the same time. It's a pretty good series. I thought the first one was a little dry, but it did pick up in the second book. The next book is called The Care and Management of Lies, and it's by Jacqueline Winspear. And Jacqueline Winspear actually writes a series of books featuring Maisie Dobbs, which is the title of the first of that series, which is also a mystery series. However, in this book, The Care and Management of Lies, we're talking about some completely different people. The main characters in this one are a young married couple named Kezia and Tom. And Kezia is a vicar's daughter, and she hasn't really had to do a lot of hard work in her life. Tom is a farmer, so she's learning how to be a farmer, and then the war begins, and Tom joins up. So she's not only learning how to be a farmer's wife, but she's also now thrust into this position of having to run this farm. And so she and Tom write letters back and forth, and in their letters they kind of leave out a lot of information that would be troubling to each other. Kezia in particular, when she writes letters, she doesn't write about the hardships of keeping this farm going and having their horses taken away and having their food rationed. Instead, she writes these letters about food that she's supposedly cooking. She's not cooking at all, but she just describes this food so it sounds so tasty and so delicious. And Tom begins reading these letters aloud to his fellow soldiers until it finally becomes like kind of an event in the trenches where everybody's like, shh, it's time for the letter. And he's having a hard time as well, not just because of war, but because one of his commanding officers is just a real jerk to him. But he leaves that kind of stuff out when he's writing to his wife as well. I cried while I was reading this book several times. It's really, really good. The next book is one that I didn't enjoy as much. It's called A Star from Mrs. Blake, and it's by April Smith. But the reason that I chose this one is that it actually taught me about two things that I didn't really know anything about. And the first of these things is that in the 1930s, the U.S. government set up a program where they sent mothers of deceased soldiers to France to see their sons' graves, which I thought was a really kind gesture because, I mean, these mothers made a sacrifice just as their sons made a sacrifice. And so on this trip, the main character here, Cora Blank, meets a reporter who, in France, who during the war suffered an injury that caused his face to be disfigured, for him to lose part of his face, in fact. And so this is the second thing that it taught me, is that there were sculptors and artists at the time who made tin masks specific to the soldiers' injuries that would cover up those injuries, because some of them are really horrific. But these masks made it possible for them to go out and not be stared at or screamed at or have people faint when they saw them, and they would be painted to look as realistic as possible. And if you saw the recent Wonder Woman movie, the doctor who does the poisons, she had a mask like that. And so while this book was not my favorite, I did put it on this list because it did teach me about these two things that I had no idea about before. And finally, probably my second favorite book on this list after Brilla of Ingleside is called The Return of the Soldier, and it's by Rebecca West. And this is a novella. In this book, a man whose name is Chris Baldry is returning from war. He's had an injury, but his is more mental. He's suffering from shell shock, and he's actually got amnesia that has erased the last 15 years of his life. So he thinks that he's 20 years old and in love with a woman named Margaret. However, in those intervening 15 years, not only has he gone to war, but he's also gotten married to another woman whose name is Kitty. So the book is narrated by Chris's cousin, whose name is Jenny, who is also in love with him. It's very odd. But a psychoanalyst comes to visit and says that he can cure Chris. And so Jenny and Kitty have to decide if it's going to be, or which decision is going to be best for Chris. Should they allow him to live in this kind of space where he's 20 years old and he's in love with this other woman and he's just kind of content and having a good time, and he's forgotten all of these horrors and terrible things that he's seen? Or do they cure him, and once he is cured, I guess, he'll be sent back to war? So do they want that 15 years back, or do they want him to be in this place where he's kind of emotionally stunted? Another book that I cried at, gasped aloud several times, sat up straight in my bed because it's so good. It's just so good. So those are some of the books that I've read dealing with women during and after World War I. I've read tons and tons more, but these are my top 7. And if you've read any, let me know what they are down in the comments and we can talk about them, and maybe we can share more ideas. Goodbyes are always awkward, so end of video.